This is sort of a bonus lecture in addition to the original series that we started doing back in February, looking at different Impressionist artists. And we'll today be looking at the art of Pierre-Auguste Renoir. He was one of the 6 founding members of Impressionism, along with Claude Monet, Berthe Morisot, Edgar Degas, whom we've all looked at in previous talks, and then also Camille Pissarro and Alfred Sisley, who we've not talked about and are slightly less well known today than their colleagues. Now, the term Impressionist applies to these artists at a particular moment in their careers, when they banded together and established their own art exhibitions independent of the art establishment. The first Impressionist exhibition was held in 1874 at the Paris studio of the great photographer Nadar. 31 artists in total participated in the show, and not all of them were practitioners of what would soon to be called Impressionism. They were some who practiced more traditional, more conventional form of art, but supported the Impressionist sort of rebellion against the establishment. So they did have allies in the art field. Well, what constituted Impressionism then? Well, if you turn in for the other talks, you probably have this memorized, but it's contemporaneity, spontaneity, unconventionality, and a focus on the optical experience. Art, they believed, should be of its time, showing everyday life, free from artifice, and rejecting the hyper-polished compositions and idealized subject matter that had really been the status quo for the last 40 plus years. What we see when we look not simply at Impressionism as a style, but at the careers of the Impressionist artists, looking at the way that they developed as artists over their lifetime, we see that Impressionism was really as much a phenomenon, a moment in time, as it was a style or a movement. Many of the so-called Impressionist artists moved away from the style and subjects of their Impressionist period and pushed their art into increasingly different directions. We certainly see that with Monet, who became increasingly focused on light and atmospheric phenomena as expressed in landscape and natural elements, to the extent that he would even almost dissolve physical forms, as we see here, into this mass of light. With Degas, he never had this sort of modeled, patchy paint application that we really associate with Impressionism. He held on to a more illusionistic and conventional manner of painting in that sense, but he expanded into sculpture and photography in addition to pastel and painting as his career went on. Morisot can be considered as maintaining an Impressionist manner throughout her career, but she really takes Impressionism to its edge, where she becomes interested in paint itself as a visual element and gives it equal importance in her work with the form being represented. So this image on the right from late in her career is as much an arrangement of paint and texture and color as it is an image of a woman doing her hair. Now, Caillebotte, like Degas, tended towards a very even application of paint so that the paint itself, unlike with Morisot, does not catch our attention, but disappears into the image being represented. Caillebotte died fairly young, but his short career explored a surprisingly wide variety of approaches to his painting. Auguste Renoir lived the longest of all of the core Impressionists and therefore had the most opportunity to take what he valued most in Impressionism and extend it to its fullest limit, to really explore the possibilities. He, like Monet, is a great example of an artist who picks out what really interests him and dedicates his life to refining and perfecting that interest, exploring all the aspects of it and trying to really master the elements that interest him. So the thing that you have to understand about Renoir is he had a very deep respect for and commitment to learning from art historical tradition. All of the Impressionists admired artists of the past. Their gripe was not with Veronese or Titian or Raphael or Ingres, but with the artists who were working in 1870 who were simply trying to repeat Veronese and Ingres. who were trying to copy the appearance of the past masters without learning from them. And the Impressionists believed that each of these great artists were great precisely because they were not trying to be someone else, nor were they stuck in the past. They were painting their time, true to themselves, true to their era. And that was what people needed to do in the 19th century as well. Now, Degas, as we've talked about, really admired and adored really Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who he had the opportunity to meet briefly when he was younger. Morisot admired Veronese, among other masters. We know that she produced a copy of this painting of the crucifixion, which was in the Louvre. But Renoir was perhaps the most committed to looking at and learning from and building on the past. He was constantly studying other artists throughout his career, and he was actually responsible for bringing the attention of other Impressionist artists to some of the past greats as well. And it's my opinion that where you don't need to understand the history of French landscape to really appreciate late Monet, although it certainly gives you a different understanding of what he's producing. You can look at one of Monet's water lily paintings and still enjoy it and still understand it. But with Renoir, it's my opinion that you really have to see his work in the context of the female nude as a tradition in art. And in fact, you have to be aware of how he's playing with tradition of the visual arts in France in general. And it's a tradition that he was enmeshed in from very early on in his life. Renoir was born in Limoges in 1841 to a lower middle class family, but Renoir's family moved to Paris just 3 years later, so he grew up in Paris, excuse me. His father was a tailor, and he apprenticed his son from ages 13 through 17 as a porcelain painter. Now, here's an example of the type of object that Renoir may have produced during his time at one of the porcelain factories around Paris, like Sèvres is one of the most famous. And what you have to keep in mind whenever you see china sets like this from before 1858 is that they were decorated by hand. So some person sat at a work table with a very fine brush and meticulously painted each piece, striving to make each design uniform and identical. These plates and cups were part of a set, and each item in the set had to look the same. It had to be perfect. Now, in the age of printers and scanners, we take exact reproduction for granted. It's almost kind of undesirable now. Now we appreciate things that are handmade and display their uniqueness and their variation. But in the 19th century, the idea of having perfectly reproduced pattern, this is impossible for human hands and eyes. And so it was the ultimate display of workmanship and skill and time, and thus luxury, to have a set like this. Renoir was naturally talented. He was very gifted. And he spent his free time at the Louvre, copying the paintings and sculptures there and learning from the art that was there. Now, in 1862, Renoir had been able to scrape enough money together to enroll in the studio school of the painter Charles Galette. There he became friends with two other students, Frédéric Bazille and Claude Monet. The three young men found that they had a common vision of a new kind of art that would be true to contemporary life as they saw and experienced it. They really clicked and really bonded. They shared a studio, went out on painting expeditions, and visited the Louvre together until the start of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. At that point, Monet moved his family to London to escape the war, whereas Renoir and Bazille both served in the military. Renoir didn't see any action, little to no action, but Bazille was killed in action in 1871, which cut short a very promising career. The trio was now reduced to a duo, and Renoir and Monet often painted side by side. So here, for example, are their paintings of a place called La Grenouillère, which means the frog pond. It was a really hip restaurant slash bathing slash boating spot outside Paris, where people could come on the weekends and just have fun and relax and socialize. And so this provided the kind of contemporaneity that appealed to the young Impressionists, as well as the opportunity to experiment with representing fluctuating effects of light and water. Here again, Monet and Renoir are painting the same bridge in Paris at the Pont Neuf, although on different days, they're representing it from the same place, the same location, and the same perspective. So it's understandable, given this closeness, that Renoir's early work very closely resembles Monet's. Now, gradually, Renoir does develop a more recognizable style, of course. Here's a garden scene that doesn't look terribly different from a Monet, but we can see that Renoir tends to use higher key colors. Everything is very bright and bold. His paintings tend to have a light, airy quality, its frothiness, and a sweetness, especially later, as if everything is made out of like foam or marzipan almond paste. Some of his paintings remind me of the marzipan fruits that you see in like French patisseries and candy shops. They're artificial, but they're sweet and they're beautiful. The next year, after this garden scene, Renoir produced this portrait of a girl standing in a garden holding a watering can. And when I say it's a portrait, I misspeak, because we're not seeing a specific girl, or at least that's not how she's presented to us. She's just a girl. The Impressionists liked just having everyday scenes. And this has the brightness, softness, and sort of hazy paint application that's characteristic of Renoir's work at this time. It also shares many characteristics with Impressionist painting more generally. For example, the way that the grass and the path behind the girl seem to lift up towards the canvas's surface instead of receding into space like space should. There's also the contemporaneity of the girl's clothing, which mark her very clearly as a young middle-class girl in 1876. And what seems like a very straightforward painting is actually a very deliberately constructed composition. It's very balanced. The girl forms an upright pillar in the center of the canvas, while the patches of green and tan around and behind her create diagonals that balance one another out, pulling the eye back to the center, but still loosening the rigidity of this composition. So this is very characteristic, again, of Impressionists as a whole, in which they strive to give the impression of spontaneity. But in truth, these are carefully constructed scenes. You notice, for example, how the bright red ribbon on the top of the girl's head, which rhymes with her little bow-shaped lips, is backed by a pocket of shadow in the garden hedge, so that the ribbon stands out all the brighter. I can't decide what's happening behind her, just beneath her right arm, but I think it's the upright tail with crooked tail and back paw of a white cat. This would be a very Impressionist addition that would lend a sense that this is not a posed portrait, that's just a casual, unplanned moment in time. But since we can't really tell what it is, and it's not entirely successful, it might be a bow on the back of her dress, but I don't think that's what it is. It's a little bit unclear. Now, the paintings that Renoir produced over the next 10 years, what we might call his late Impressionist period, are his most popular, including this painting from 1876, Dance at the Moulin de la Galette. The Moulin de la Galette was one of the many café concerts that were very popular in and around Paris at this time. With industrialization, people began having set work shifts, which means that you have set time off, which meant that you now had set leisure time. If you work on a farm, you are working around the clock. There is no on time or off time. Whereas working in the city as a shop girl or in a factory or on the docks, you had to be there at a certain time. So you had designated leisure time. And so these spaces for entertainment, like the La Renoir and like these café concerts, just popped up all over the place and were very popular. At the Moulin de la Galette, you could have drinks and refreshments, but they also had music. They had live music there, and a large space outside where people could dance. Although, as I say, live music, I'm like, all music in 1876 was live. So Here, Renoir is showing us a moment in his life as he and Monet would come here very often and just hang out with their friends. So it's not an important scene in the usual sense. It's not the kind of monumental event that usually gets painted. There's nothing happening here other than what normally happens at a café concert. No one's particularly important in the worldly sense. There's no Greek goddesses or important political figures or something like that. It's the kind of everyday moment in Parisian urban modern life that the Impressionists loved. And it's also a way for Renoir to say that really this everyday life, these everyday people, these anonymous people having little moments of joy are important. In fact, they are actually as important as these mythological scenes, these huge paintings of Diana hunting or something like that, or of battles from 100 years ago. But modern life and the lives of normal people on a day-to-day basis are in themselves heroic and worthwhile and important and beautiful and worthy of being painted and being seen. This setting and this topic also gave Renoir an opportunity to practice with light effects as the light filters through the trees, leaving these dappled highlights on the dresses and suits and on the ground. This is a very challenging subject to take on. This is a large group of people, a wide open space, and he's having to convincingly depict so many people in movement. It's a very ambitious work. Renoir's solution is to paint the figures very loosely so that the farther away they are, the less and less substantial they are, the less and less detailed, and just like we see in reality. But this looseness and softness also applies to the midground and the foreground, so that even the figures closest to us at this table have a little bit of this fuzziness to them, a little bit of a haze over them. And the woman in the pink dress, for example, she's not that far from us, but her and her partner's faces are blurred. So all of this gives a sense of movement, as if everyone's in motion so that we can't quite fix our eyes on them enough to really get a crisp image. Notice too the casual poses of the group closest to us. One man has his back to us, which both suggests that this scene is not composed for our benefit, since we're being ignored. And it also suggests, ironically, that we're part of this scene, since space seems to exist behind him, a space in which we can be standing. There's a wide range of people here too, a range of social types. In the bottom left corner are a couple of children. One of them, a blonde girl with her hair loose, kind of streaming loose. There are men in black suits and top hats, sort of the uniform of the middle and upper class. Other men are wearing these straw boating hats that are very, appropriate for younger men on a summer's day, and appropriate for this informal, casual, joyful setting. We also see different degrees of refinement in the women's dress. We see these simpler dresses of the women who are closer to us, and then the more elaborate gown of the woman in pink. So we can see that these café concerts were places of leisure where there was a mixing of classes. Now, certainly there are different venues that attracted and catered to different clientele, to be sure. But these were flexible social spaces where people could enjoy modern urban life. This is characteristic of Renoir's art throughout his career, not just of this period of his work. He favored joyful, beautiful, attractive subject matter, and he strove to convey the emotion attached to that subject through the way in which he painted. He's trying to convey this vibrancy, this energy, this lightness that he feels in this setting to us through his painting. And just as a side note, this painting was purchased by the artist Gustave Caillebotte, and was part of Caillebotte's large bequest of Impressionist paintings to the French state. And so that's how it ended up being in the Musée d'Orsay. It was part of this large collection that the state received. Renoir approached the topic again 7 years later, the topic of dance, But here the focus is on a particular couple rather than the collective festivities. But even though we have all of the focus on just two people, on a particular couple, they're still anonymous. They're just normal people. They're not supposed to be specific individuals like Madame and Monsieur so-and-so. We don't even see the man's face. So the subject is really not even these two individuals, but joy, beauty, youth, the joy of youth, the energy of dance. The painting is quite large, about 6 feet tall, and the way that the ground seems to rush downwards. If you look at the man's feet and the lower portion of the painting, it doesn't seem to match the top 2/3. It seems suddenly very flat, and as if they're not really standing on anything, as if there's a slope and they're just going to slip right down the painting, like he's going to pick her up in a twirl that will land her right outside the frame, right in front of us in the next moment. Renoir wants us, he wants the viewer to be swept up just as she is. Now there's artistic precedent for this sort of thing, but to find it, we look not to Ingres or the Baroque masters or the Renaissance. Renoir is drawing largely, for most of his career, from the Rococo of the mid-18th century. Now, perhaps it would be better to say that he's almost rehabilitating the Rococo, because the style has long been seen as frivolous at best, degenerate at worst. The entire point of the Rococo style is basically carefreeness, and the disdain leveled at it is partly due to the fact that the style was almost by definition the domain of the absolute monarchy in the mid-1700s. It primarily appears in the decorative arts, and it survived for quite a while in porcelain. So here, for example, is a statuette in the collection of the Cleveland Museum of Art that is adapted from a design by the Rococo painter Antoine Boucher. Now, this is a mass-produced object that is seen here in an unfinished state. It would have finished but looked something like the one on the left, which has been painted and glazed. It's the job that Renoir had, doing these touch-ups, these touches of paint on these unfinished sculptures and plates. So here also is a plate from a French set with the central scene copied from a Boucher painting. So as a porcelain painter, Renoir then would have been quite familiar with the Rococo aesthetic from his artistic beginnings. And even as the Rococo style sort of went out, these kind of motifs remained in the decorative arts, because frankly, you don't really want to have a plate with, you know, some epic battle scene with people dying on it. It's just not fun at meal times. It's much nicer to have, you know, nymphs drinking wine or something like that. So the Rococo is very appropriate for the decorative arts. Now you can compare this well-known painting by another Rococo artist, Jean-Henri Fragonard, with Renoir's dance at Bougival. We have a beautiful young aristocratic woman, fashionably dressed, joyfully, really even gleefully, swinging in an ambiguously idyllic garden setting. Now, like most of Fragonard's work, this one has an erotic tone, as a young man, presumably the woman's lover, is positioned in the bottom left, hidden in the foliage, such that he can look up her skirt every time she swings forward. At first, this doesn't have much connection with Renoir's scene, which is really very natural and earthy and wholesome by comparison. But stay with me here. Renoir is essentially updating and bringing the Rococo down to earth. That is, he's taking the themes that were popular in the Rococo, themes that he really loved and caught his attention when he looked at these artworks. Themes like romantic love, youth, play, beauty, abundance, etc. He's taking those themes out of the mid-18th century, out of the elitism, out of this specific milieu that was very privileged, and he's taking them into the 19th century, into Paris, taking them out of this idyllic non-place, this utopia, and putting them in the Moulin de la Galette. Now, looking back at this painting of the girl with the watering can from 1876, now you can see that Renoir's style and paint handling in 1883, so 7 years later, is both tighter and more varied. So in the painting of the girl, the whole painting, it has the same texture, so that whether it's fabric or skin or gravel or grass, it's a pretty consistent sort of texture and paint application. In the dance on the right, we see Renoir presenting a smoother, almost harder surface and slightly varying his paint applications for different areas. So the background is just this quick swashing, this blurring of chartreuse and teal to suggest the sunlit foliage. But you can notice the smoothness in the man's pant leg. And then there are very subtle variations in color in the woman's skirt, just individual strokes of tan and white and pink and blue even. The edges of things are more defined in this later painting as well. Forms and colors no longer just blur into one another. In the painting of the girl with the watering can, you can see there's no hard edges. If you look at the line of her dress, for example, it's kind of soft, as if you can't quite tell is the gravel in front of the dress or behind it. There's no hard edge. They kind of infringe on one another. Now, these kinds of scenes of everyday life, what were called genre scenes, as well as portraits, landscapes, those are mostly what Renoir painted until the mid-1880s. The female nude, however, was a subject with a very, very long tradition in Western art, and it was very popular in the 19th century. So the fact that Renoir didn't produce a female nude until 1884 suggests his real commitment, his impressionistic commitment to contemporary everyday life, to the beauty that he saw in the everyday. Now, Renoir began work on this painting, the large bathers or grands baigneuses, in 1884, and he completed it 3 years later. Now, in subject matter, it seems quite unlike anything he did before, but once again, we have Renoir drawing from art historical tradition. A few years earlier, in 1881, he was finally financially stable enough to travel to Algeria, Spain, and Italy. And the artwork he saw on this trip convinced him that, in his words, Impressionism was a dead end. And he was especially impressed by the frescoes of the Renaissance painter Raphael that he saw in Italy. Here's one example of a Raphael fresco. And fresco is a technique in which pigment is applied to plaster directly onto the wall, either when the plaster is still wet, which is called wet fresco, or after it's dried and using an egg-based binder to fix the pigment to the wall. In both cases, fresco tends to have this dry, matte appearance, unlike oil painting, which is naturally very lush, very wet, very shiny. You can not do the same effects with fresco that you can with oil paint. You don't have the same liberty of blending colors and forms together. And the fresco painting, either the egg binder substance or the plaster, they both dry very quickly. So here, Renoir is imitating the appearance of fresco using oil paints. There's a kind of dryness, a powderiness to this painting that looks more like fresco than it does like an oil painting. There are also similarities here with both Raphael and Ingres, the great 19th century French painter, who worked very much in a Raphael-inspired style. In fact, this is sometimes referred to as Renoir's Ingres period. Notice the way in which the figures are arranged in space so that the three main women are pushed up really close to the surface of the canvas. In fact, it looks like the brunette is about to fall off the bank and out of the frame. Her right bottom is not sitting on anything. They're setting the trees and foliage behind the women on the left seem very close, like there's just no space in this portion of the painting. On the right, we get some depth as we see two more women farther away, and then a vague pastel landscape, but it doesn't feel very believable. It feels like we're looking at a stage backdrop, as if there's a painted wall just a few feet behind those more distant bathers. So it's open enough that this painting doesn't feel claustrophobic, but the composition is arranged, similarly to a relief sculpture, a frieze, like what Renoir would have seen in Italy. And these kinds of ancient Greek and Roman images had inspired Raphael and Ingres as well. We also know that, again, Renoir very much admired the Rococo sculptures at Versailles. So here is an example of a relief sculpture placed in a fountain, which is why it's not in great shape. You can't see it very clearly because of the variation in tone due to the dampness of the stone. But you can see that we have here nymphs playing in a marshy setting with women reclining on either side up on the banks. So again, a horizontal arrangement of nude women playing and bathing. There's something very awkward about this painting. The poses of the two women on the bank feel very posed, very artificial. The brunette isn't as awkward as the blonde, who seems to be very self-consciously exposing her torso to us. When I first saw this painting, I thought that the brunette was turning away from the blonde, basically telling her to cover it up. But what's actually happening, if you haven't already figured it out, is that the younger girl in the water is splashing the brunette. And so the brunette is turning away and telling her to knock it off. And the young girl, I think, is pretty successful. Her pose is really natural, at least, compared to the other women. And the way her chin juts out, the way her head is turned and sticking her neck out, it has this kind of insolence about it that's, I think, very appropriate for a younger girl, sort of playfully picking on her older companions and being a little bit of, a tease and messing with them. The differences in age is also clear in their bodies. The girl is thinner, bonier in a way that's appropriate for a girl. But there's a problem with her hair. You see, the blonde's hair is arranged in a way that we could take her for a nymph, or at least it isn't period specific. The setting's pretty ambiguous. It doesn't feel like a specific place. This could be France or Italy or, some Arcadian utopia. It's general enough not to feel too real. The brunette, if you look closely, has pins and combs in her hair to hold it up, which risks putting her in the 19th century. But the girl's braid with the ribbon looks so 19th century that it's impossible to take her for anything other than a 19th century Parisian girl who is out in the suburbs with her friends on holiday, which makes this painting sort of awkward because it feels too real. I do think that we can understand this painting, like the dance at Bougie Ball, as Renoir taking a Rococo theme and trying to modernize it. We know that he loved this painting by Boucher of the Roman goddess Diana at her bath. He said it was one of his first loves in art, and he continued to love it throughout his life. And there were certainly other precedents. Women bathing or wading was a variation on the female nude and a kind of standard subgenre. But in spite of his 3 years of working out the composition, doing figure studies, and smaller sketches of his grand baigneuses, it was thoroughly trounced by critics at exhibition. He was really shocked because he was so proud of the painting. He thought he had really achieved a masterpiece with this. He combines here everything that he has learned so far. We have the lightness and brightness of Impressionism, the softness and texture of fresco, the playfulness and decorative quality of the Rococo, and also the sculptural linearity of bodies that he would have learned from Raphael and from Ingres, all combining these things into one composition. The fact that it was so poorly received really discouraged him, understandably, and he never again devoted so much time and preparation to a painting. These kinds of scenes are what Renoir is perhaps best popularly known for today. Dances, beautiful women, everyday moments like two girls painting the piano. His technique has softened in the 5 years since The Bathers. Those women were very polished, hard, almost. But here the flesh has a believable softness to it. The figures have a solidity and a volume, but so look, for example, at the white section of the wall in the background. The subtleties of light on the wall surface are represented by long vertical strokes, and this white wall turns out to be made up of tan and green-gray and blue. It's almost like Renoir is sort of drawing with the paint in these long individual strokes that inherently add liveliness to the surface, that just activating it or energizing it in a sense, giving the whole thing this liveliness. Now, as for the subject matter, this is a private moment, unlike the dance scenes, but we're still in the realm of the good, beautiful, sweet moments of life. Renoir could have presented this subject any number of ways, but with the arrangement of colors, the closeness of the two girls, their mutual engagement in the music, and the way our view is closely cropped in to focus on just them, these elements all create a sense of warmth and contentment, a kind of vibrant peacefulness. So here, for a point of comparison, is the same subject represented a few years earlier by Renoir's close friend and fellow Impressionist Morisot. The two saw one another's work regularly, so there was undoubtedly some mutual inspiration going on. Morisot's is a pastel, non-oil painting, so the effect is inevitably different right there. But the composition and the atmosphere, the feeling, is quite different from what Renoir is showing us. Morisot's image gives the impression of normalcy, like this is just a moment in the daily routine of a household when the girls are practicing their piano lesson and someone else is going out the door to run errands and other things going around them. There's also an ambiguity in Julie's pose, the brunette on the left side, who was Morisot's daughter and frequent model. We can't tell whether Julie is interested or bored or daydreaming or learning. It's really hard to tell. Renoir produced 3 versions of his painting of girls at the piano, as well as other paintings that have an entirely different composition, but they're that same subject of girls playing piano. So in his variations on this same composition, he is trying out different options, seeing, does this vase shape look better, or should I put her arm here or here, for example? But they all have this warmth to it that's very characteristic of Renoir. Now, in 1885, when Renoir was in the midst of working on the large bathers, his first son, Pierre, was born to him, and Aline Charigot, a dressmaker who had modeled for him and who is included in this famous luncheon of the boating party here on the left, as well as Gustave Caillebotte, the artist sitting on the right. And Caillebotte was actually close enough friends with Renoir that he was the godfather to Renoir's third son, Pierre. And Elaine was just 18 years, not 18 years old. She was 18 years younger than Renoir. And 5 years after Pierre was born, the couple married, and 2 more sons followed, Jean and Claude. Here we see Jean as a baby with Gabrielle, the family's maid, who also modeled for Renoir. Now, Jean, as you may know, went on to become an accomplished film director. If you have not seen The Grand Illusion, I highly recommend it. It's an excellent film. That is his work. The other children, Pierre became an actor and Claude was a ceramicist. So they were all, creative people. Here we see Jean not as a great film director, but as a very chubby-cheeked baby playing with toys and sitting on Gabrielle's lap. This is a much simpler composition than Girls at the Piano, and I think it's more successful personally. As with the Girls at the Piano, Renoir also produced multiple versions of this painting, trying out different colors and details. The simplicity of this painting, the convincing expression of affection, and frankly, the tenderness and sweetness of the subject give this painting not only a real charm, but a really engaging quality. There's no profusion of details, no distracting ambiguity of space or depth, and there's a real mastery of form. Gabrielle has a solidity about her, and John is tucked into her arm so convincingly that you can almost feel the weight of his little body. Notice too the way that Gabrielle forms a pyramid, a solid monumental visual anchor that dominates the structure of the painting. Now, the painting isn't perfect. Gabrielle's left hand in particular is a little awkward and not totally convincing, but Renoir is prioritizing the overall feeling of softness, affection, and innocence. The fact that he produced multiple versions, seeking out the right combination of colors, shows that this is really a question of arranging the particular elements to create a specific effect, not necessarily trying to produce an illusion, an exact reproduction of reality, but trying to convey this harmony of technique and color and arrangement throughout the painting. So this somewhat boneless left hand is practically irrelevant against all of that. Now, Renoir was not finished with the subject of the female nude, even after the critical failure of the large bathers, and he returned to the topic multiple times in the remainder of his career. Here we have a painting in the collection of the Cleveland Museum of Art. It is currently not on view, but perhaps will be up at some other installation. We have here 3 women in the foreground and 2 others farther away. Again, we have 2 women, or rather one of the women teasing the other. This time the blonde in the middle has a crab in her right hand that she's shoving in the other girl's face, kind of being a jerk, honestly. The contemporaneity is much clearer here than the other painting, as we have not drapery, but dresses. These dresses with their print patterns. The red dress has a ruffle on the collar, and then a straw hat with feathers, all marking this very clearly at a particular point in time. The setting is vaguely Mediterranean, and there's a very different arrangement of space compared to large bathers, whereas that one was horizontally oriented parallel to the canvas surface. This one goes back into space so that we actually have a projection of depth into the distance. And this blue color of the water is absolutely gorgeous. It really resonates and just kind of glows. Another difference is that instead of presenting the women to us in a rather contrived fashion, the women ignore us entirely. So Renoir is really focusing here on creating bodies that are solid without being hard. In the grand bathers like Campagne's, there was a polished quality to the skin, a very real smoothness and hardness, as if they were almost made of marble. Here he's trying to avoid that effect, but still create an impression of solidity and form and mass. So you can see that there's a lot of attention on the back, hip, and thigh of the girl on the right, the victim of the teasing. There's a shifting from almost a kind of green gray at the top of her hip to pink and light yellow to create this sense of roundness and substance. And rather than smoothing out, disguising the brush strokes, they're left visible, again, like the painting of the girls at the piano, to create this sense of vibrancy, as if the whole thing is just kind of I don't know, vibrating, reverberating with energy. The, again, subject matter is not necessarily the focus or the main purpose or point of the painting here. Renoir really is interested in creating a harmonious composition. He likes the lines that are created by the bodies. He likes the colors, the shape that is generated by these shifting tones. Those are really the focus of the work. Again, this scene is not without precedent. I think it's kind of odd. Perhaps just because the girl with the crab seems so aggressively aggressive in her teasing. I think it's a little strange, but again, it's not without precedent. And we can look to the Rococo for an example, this time by Fragonard. And we don't have clearly 19th century French women here, like we do with Renoir, but a gaggle of women who exist outside of time or any specific space, and apparently outside of the confines of gravity as well. I don't know what is happening with this woman in the middle with the pink drapery who seems to be floating. But it kind of doesn't matter, because this image is about beauty, about fun, about the enjoyment of line and color as its arrangement on the canvas. Now, instead of splashing or chasing each other with shellfish, two of the women at the right seem to be wrestling or something. The woman sort of facing us has this gleeful laughing expression that suggests that they're playing some sort of game. It doesn't make any sense, but it really isn't supposed to. It's supposed to be pretty and light and pleasant. This is beauty for beauty's sake. We see these same compositional elements repeated yet again in one of Renoir's final paintings, and one that is considered to be the culmination of all of his work. I think it is also safe to say that this is where Renoir loses many of his fans. The dance at Bougival is readily comprehensible. It's pleasant, it's pretty. It doesn't require a lot of understanding of art history theory to be appreciated. The Bathers of 1919 here, however, in my opinion, is accessible really by considering the two factors that we've been tracing throughout this overview of Renoir's career: his relationship to art history and his pursuit of form and the arrangement of paint on the canvas. At this point, you've probably gotten a sense of what Renoir is doing. By the later part of his career, Renoir is focusing on either interior scenes of family or friends or on female nudes. In both cases, he's trying to maintain the light and spontaneity of Impressionism while bringing in greater materiality and mass and form. Impressionism has a tendency to dissolve form. It has a tendency to turn all shapes, all mass into equal levels of density. And we can see that extremely clearly with Monet's Cathedral series, in which this monumental mass of stone is turned into lace or mist. And Renoir didn't want to have that. He wanted things to feel solid. So how do you translate three-dimensionality onto a two-dimensional surface without returning to the way painting was done before Impressionism, without returning to illusionism? This is the answer that Renoir came up with. He has not abandoned the lessons of Impressionism, but he's playing with the tension between flatness and form, arranging shapes and colors in the way a florist arranges flowers or a composer arranges notes. He's not denying the materiality of paint on canvas. He's not claiming to present us with reality as we see it, but rather reality as it is felt. The felt sense of form, mass, shape, the felt sense of life, vibrancy, pleasure, beauty. Beauty was Renoir's watchword. And I think that it is part of why he is disdained today, is that he, on the whole, produces two, of course, this is a very broad generalization, types of paintings. Readily accessible, very sweet, beautiful works like the Dance at Bougival, and frankly, rather odd nudes like this one here, where the women seem very lumpy and a little bit odd. And in art history, the tendency has been to disdain work and art that is simply pleasant. Pleasance, beauty, love, those sorts of things have come to be disdained by critics throughout the 20th century, such that when we look at Renoir and we say, oh, but it's so pretty and charming, that almost makes it sound like we're talking down about it. But for Renoir, beauty was everything. In 1919, when he completed this painting, Renoir was 78. For the past 27 years of his life, he dealt with increasingly severe and painful rheumatoid arthritis to the point that his joints actually became deformed. He was eventually limited to a wheelchair and had to have his brush put into his hand because he could not bend his fingers enough to pick it up. We see him painting here in 1919, the year he died. The art historian Walter Peck visited the artist multiple times and said that sometimes Renoir would be talking eagerly about art. He was just so excited to talk about art, not just his art, but art in general. And then an attack of arthritic pain would seize him, and it would be as much as 10 minutes before he could talk again. Now, at one point, a young Henri Matisse was visiting Renoir and asked him why he continued painting when it was so obviously difficult and painful for him. Renoir responded poignantly, "The pain passes, the beauty remains." Thank you very much for tuning in today. And if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. You can either type your question into the chat function or use the raise hand function and you can be unmuted, whichever is preferred.
Well, I have one question.
All right.
Oh, there's a question in the chat, so do that first.
Did you record the prior presentations? I would love to see them too. Yes, they are available on the Heights Library's YouTube page. I believe that John can put the link in them in here for you. So.
Yes, I can do that. But you were talking at the beginning, not, I guess it wasn't in the presentation, but in your publicity about the protest.
Yes.
Yeah, could you just mention, because that sounds perfectly ridiculous.
Yes, I wasn't sure whether I should squeeze it into the presentation or not, but yeah, a few years ago, unfortunately, I was no longer working at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston because I would have loved to have been there. A group of people protested outside of the museum. I had picket, signs and everything saying that Renoir's art does not belong in a museum, that he's a bad artist, his paintings are terrible, and he should not be in the museum. Now, it was largely a joke, but I think it really touches on a common sentiment around Renoir's art. I mentioned to my best friend, another art historian who is, very, very, accomplished and has a lot of knowledge and deep appreciation of art, that I mentioned to her that I was doing a presentation on Renoir, and she said, "I hate Renoir." I was like, honestly, he's not my favorite either. And that's why I'm doing this presentation, because I thought I am determined to understand this man's art. And one of the things that I learned is that he produced thousands of paintings over his career. And some of them are extremely beautiful and very, really excellent. There are others where I cannot get past the fact that it looks like his women have no bones. And that I just don't like it. But I understand what he's doing. I understand that for Renoir, he was not, the point was not to produce anatomical reality. It was to produce something that was soft and beautiful. And I think that however much we might sort of intellectually, in our intellectual arrogance, sometimes disdain the idea of something as just beautiful, I think someone who suffered as much as Renoir both early on in his career being in complete poverty, and then later in his life with this just constant chronic pain. I think that he has earned the right to paint whatever he wants, however he wants. And I think it's proof, actually, his life is proof that beauty has value in itself. So should Renoir be considered a great impressionist? Yes, he should. If for no other reason than that he was one of the central figures of the movement. Everyone, he was friends with everybody. He was really critical in the organization of their exhibitions. His work is important. And however much I may not always enjoy his art, he is good. He is a good artist. And I have to say, the picture of Gabrielle holding Jean, I think is really charming. I really enjoy that. So did Renoir eventually reject Impressionism or incorporate Old Master style with Impressionism? Yes, he did. He said after coming back from Italy that he had a kind of a moment, like an existential crisis, where he realized, looking at all of these artworks from the Renaissance, that he said Impressionism is a dead end. We can't, we can't go any farther in this direction. And so then he had to figure out, okay, well, what's left? And like, what do I do? I'm not going to go back and rehash what has been done the past, 100 years. So here's what I've learned from Impressionism about the way that the eye works and the way light behaves, and the way that color is not simply one color, but made up of multiple other colors, and that surfaces, however solid they may be, reflect light and seem alive. So how do I take these things, but also reconcile them with the solidity of form that he sees in like Michelangelo, for example, or the other works of the great Renaissance and Baroque masters. And that, this was his answer, was what he considered his greatest work was this Bathers. And if you're familiar with the work of Rubens or Michelangelo, the female form here is not that far off from what these great artists were doing. And what's interesting, and one of the reasons that Renoir has continued to be valued today by his fans in the critical world, in the world of art history, that he interestingly fits very nicely into this evolution of painting, that the next step is abstraction. Because the argument of many so-called modernists, as they're referred to in art history, and abstract painters, is that the paintings like Bouguereau's on the right here are lies. The artist is lying to us because he's denying the materiality of paint and canvas. And so honest painting, the most painting-ish painting, it would be a painting that is simply paint on canvas, simply marks on canvas. Now, Renoir here with the Bathers is still representing something. He's still showing us things. So 2 women in the foreground, 3 others in the background, landscape, a hat, a dress, foliage. These are all recognizable images to us. So he's not gone completely abstract, but you cannot look at this and confuse it for reality. When you see this painting, there's an equal recognition of the images and the things it's supposed to represent, and the materiality of paint and canvas that is representing it. There's no getting away from the fact that this is paint sitting on a flat surface, and that, if you look at the space, the flowers between the 2 women in this wedge that's constructed by their 2 torsos, it's almost like it's farther forward than they are. And so there's this denial of depth and of perspective in the way that we're traditionally used to it is also an embrace and a recognition of the flat surface of the canvas. And this is a very modern thing to do. And so Renoir was very, very much admired by Matisse, for example, who came to visit him, and really admired by many of the sort of early 20th century artists, because they recognized that he was doing something really different here, that he was moving towards a recognition of painting as such, which is what they were interested in. So that's a very long answer to a very short question. That's my specialty.